1 year before is a measure of what they were at their best, and the current level is how much the drought has affected. In fact, you see it, plots that had few species had a greater proportional impact. They had a bigger disturbance. They lost more of their biomass as a result of the drought when compared to plots that had higher species diversity. And again, the relationship's not linear, but this sort of asymptotic relationship where the most increase in performance comes from adding species initially, and then the relative increase in performance is slower and lower if you keep adding species. So the question is why? What is it about more diverse communities that improves their net primary productivity and their stability? What benefit is having more than one species given? You want to throw out an idea? Why? Anybody? Sure you've been thinking about it all Wednesday. Right? What's the answer?
What did you do?
Nobody? Hang it out there. Stick your chin out.
I can't move it because it is.
Well, think about it. Think about, consider all of you as separate species. That wouldn't be too much of a stretch, right? And get a bunch, get a room with 3 of you in it, and get a room with 15 of you in it, and have a bunch of tasks that have to be done, right? Or let's take it to an extreme. Let's say you can clone yourself. There are 10 of you, or you can take 10 different people, and then you're presented with different challenges, different tasks. Doing some programming maybe, or playing a game of golf, or cooking something, right? Think about which would more likely be able to pull that off with a degree of efficiency. Probably the room with 10 different people, because everyone's got different talents and skills, right? They bring a different skill set to the table. Well, it's the same thing with communities. So when you have a diverse community, they're able to use a broader resource base. So some organisms can maybe have roots that go down deeper and can tap into deeper moisture. Others have higher drought resistance. Maybe they don't grow as well, but they're more drought resistant. Maybe some organisms have these nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots, so they can produce nutrients and that they add to the community. So the point is that the more different species you have, the more that they can more completely use all the available resources that plot offers. If you just have the same species or low numbers of species, they're not going to be as efficient at utilizing the whole resource. Kind of think about it like a carcass on the Serengeti. Think back to that picture of that hyena that had its head in that carcass of a zebra, right? Well, think about all the different animals that eat that carcass. The lions get there, they eat the liver and a few bits of the choicest meat, right? And then they leave the rest. Now, if it was only lions, that would be a waste of that resource. But then the hyenas move in and eat some of the other things, and then the vultures move in, and then other scavengers, and then the maggots eventually get there, and then finally bacteria, and the whole thing breaks down, and before you know it, there's no carcass left. Just a few bleached bones, and even those break down over time. So when you combine all those different species, they're much more efficient at utilizing all that resource. It's the same idea in plant communities. The more different species of plants, the more efficient they will be at taking all the different components of those resources. But diverse communities are more likely to have redundant species. Now, what concept does this draw on? They connect the dots. We talk about fundamental concept in ecology. Rhymes with fish. Niche, okay? All right, there you go. So, if you think about a niche, what's true of almost every organism with respect to its niche? It rarely occupies
fundamental niche.
But if someone who's a better competitor for a portion of that fundamental niche is removed, that organism can expand out and fill in that portion of its niche that's not occupied. So if you have lots of species, the chances are, if one of them gets lost, there'll be another species that can move in and fill that role. Okay? That's like a workforce that has repetitive skills, right? That has overlap in your job description, right? So you can fill in for someone. You may be back in the stockroom most of the time, but you can run the cash register. So if the cashier calls in sick that day, you're able to go up and run the register. Right? The same idea in plant communities. When you have a diverse community, if you lose one, But the function that organism provided to that community won't be lost because someone can step in and play that role. Okay? But if you have fewer species, the chances are that if someone gets lost, there won't be someone to step in and fill that role. It's greater. So that has to do with the stability of the community, ability to absorb and impact and recover from. So diverse communities are more productive and more stable. So these redundant species can fill in the role of species with similar functions if they're reduced or lost. So the point is you have built-in redundancy. It's kind of like flying an airplane, right? You fly an airplane, there's not one hydraulic system, there's actually 3 or 4, right? Because if one fails, it's nice to have a backup, right? These are kind of like backup redundancy systems that can step in and fill the role, okay? So the more diverse a community is, the more likely it's not going to lose any significant function if one of those species is lost. As you start lowering the species number, the more likely that a loss of the species will significantly reduce the function of that community because there'll be no other species that can fill in and replace its role. Okay. Now I want to start talking about community dynamics. And a lot of what we know about community dynamics, how communities change through time, comes from studying communities that have been disturbed. Because, you know, what's the first thing you do? If you want to find out about something, you poke it, or tweak it, or disturb it, right? Okay? The classic line, famous last word. What does this button do, right? Okay. Be on my tombstone. Or where's your mother there? Right? Okay. So, there's 2 views that have been adopted in ecological thinking about how communities work. One is a more traditional view that was initially widely popular, and one's a more modern synthesis that's been proposed for quite a while, but it's only gained acceptance in the latter half of the 20th century. Okay. One view was proposed by a guy named Frederick Clements, the Clementsian view of community function. And he had a very anthropomorphic and romantic view of community dynamics. He liked to impart people-like qualities on a community instead of function in a way that we envision humans function in society. He saw communities as superorganisms, right? So just like an organism is a collection of organ systems, so you could think of organ systems as, you know, all combining to form this functioning organism. He saw communities as a bunch of different species all working integratively to create this entity known as the community. Right? So you could kind of look at the community itself as an individual entity with its own properties. And in this view, species basically work cooperatively. They all had a job to do, a role to play in that community. And they were there to do it for the good of the community. Now, you can see this is kind of running in stark contrast to everything we talked about for the first half of the quarter, right? Does that sound like organisms trying to improve their individual fitness? No. It's kind of like, what's the opening to A Tale of Two Cities, right? Or no, not the opening, but what did the character say? It's by far a better thing I do than I have ever done before, when he offered himself to the guillotine so the other person could live. That's how he saw community species. When it's time to go, they go willingly because they go for the good of the community, right? There was a very different view proposed in the late 1930s by a guy named Gleason, Henry Gleason, who was mostly a plant systematist, a botanist who studied plant taxonomy, but he also thought about the role plants play in communities. And most of this work centered on plants for the same reasons we've talked about. When you study communities, it's much easier to study plant communities because they have the good grace to not pick up and move, you know, and run away from things like that. And so it's easier to study plants. And he had a very different view. He said, no, you know, communities are a collection of individual species, and they all have their unique physiological tolerances, right? And they have a very individualistic approach to the community. They're in it for one thing and one thing only, themselves, right? And they're not going to go anywhere for the benefit of someone else. They're going to sit there clawing tooth and nail, kicking and screaming as long as they can, trying to get as much fitness as they can before they get pushed out unwillingly by somebody else. And they couldn't give a damn about the good of the community. It's all, about themselves. They're the kind of species that say, well, enough about me, what do you think about me? Type of attitude, right? So it's a very different view of community dynamics. And one that jives much better with how we envision evolution to be driving this. And remember, ecology is a product of evolutionary forces, so it makes sense that this might be a more realistic view of how communities operate. So, one of the ways that these views evolved and were elucidated was through the study of communities recovering from disturbance. And that study is something called succession. So succession is basically the recovery of a community after disturbance. And when you study the successional process, it gives you insight into how communities work. So just like a lot of what we learned about how the human body operates, we learned from watching it heal from injury or from other types of trauma. A lot of what we understand about how communities function is when we see it gets tweaked or disturbed, in the process of recovery, we learn something about the dynamics, how species are interacting. And there are two categories, broad categories of succession, and it has to do with extreme. Primary succession is absolutely starting with a blank slate. In primary succession, the disturbance removes all the species, and in the case of terrestrial ecosystems, all the soil and propagules, things like spores and seeds and things of that nature, they're removed. And you start with a blank slate. So there's nothing there that's going to influence what kind of a community develops. Everything that develops after the disturbance comes from external input. There's no predisposition, there's no bias to what kind of community will be established there by virtue of plants or animals still existing there, or seeds or other things left behind. So what would be an example of a disturbance that could do this kind of blank slating? Fire? No, not fire. Fire doesn't remove the soil, and a lot of the trees and the propagules survive. More drastic. Meteors.
Volcano.
A volcano, a lava flow, that's right. You cover the ground with lava, pretty much nothing's going to survive that, right? Okay, so when lava cools, you're starting with a blank slate. Or take the other extreme. When a glacier retreats, it's covered in soil for 10,000 years. It's sterile, and there's nothing in it, and it's a blank slate. We're going to talk extensively at the end of today's lecture about a natural experiment that is basically a glacier that's been retreating for 200 years. And you can follow, like in a time machine, the successional pathway, because the farther up, the closer to the glacier you get, the more recent it's been exposed. The farther away, the longer it's been recovered. So that's a very neat example. So these are things like glacier retreats or lava flows, things that totally destroy the environment and leave nothing of the original community behind. In contrast, secondary succession is less severe, and there's a broad spectrum. It goes from something as simple as a single plant being torn, which would be a very, very minor disturbance, to basically most of the organisms removed, but just some of the soil left behind with some of the seeds or spores. It could be like a severe fire or a severe flood or something like that. So here, some or all of the species are removed, but the soil and propagules are left intact. So there is a predisposition, there is a bias towards what's going to sprout up there, because there's a vestige, a trace of the old community left behind that's going to influence the successional process. You're not starting with a blank slate. All right, so those are the two categories of succession that we can talk about when we talk about the recovery of the disturbed community. So maybe a fire removes a lot of vegetation, soil is maintained, things deep areas of soil survive. Large trees can survive the fire. How many remember we're around for the 2008 fire down by Watsonville? Remember that? Anyone remember that? No? Okay? A lot of those trees look like they were burned. Within 3 weeks, the leaves sprouted out and they're right back to where they were. So that would be an example of a secondary succession. All right, so here's two examples of primary and secondary succession. They look very similar, but there are distinct differences. So on the top is an example of primary succession. Basically, a glacier retreats and sterile soils are exposed that haven't been exposed for 10,000 years or more. They've been under hundreds, if not thousands, of feet of ice, under pressure and extreme cold. Nothing's living in them, and then the soil's exposed and stuff starts growing in it. Right? And the youngest exposed moraine has shrubs and early type of plants, and then they're replaced by slightly larger trees and shrubs. And by the time some 100 years or plus, you wind up with this final climax community of slow-growing, very superior competitive plants, like these large conifer trees. And so there are different communities, transitions, that pass through the successional process. We'll talk about that. Here's an example of secondary succession. Here, it's a field that's been plowed for years and years, and agricultural crops are grown, and then the farmer says, I'm done. I'm tired of farming. And he just lets his field go fallow, right? And so that's not primary because there's dirt and soil and seeds and spores and things of that nature still in that dirt. And they're going to influence what grows there. And then you have the same process where first weeds come, and then the weeds are replaced by shrubs, and shrubs by small trees, and then gradually by large trees. And this is exactly what's happened all over New England. I think I asked anyone in the class from New England? Nobody. Okay. Well, if you go to New England, you walk through the forests there, you find these stone walls for these acre plots or bigger. And people who live there go, oh yeah, that used to be a farm. And it's a thick, deciduous forest, right? You go, farm? Well, 200 years ago, they did a lot of farming in it, and they cleared these tracts of land. And then when farming moved largely to the south and to the Midwest, the farms in New England were abandoned, and they recovered. And over the course of 150 years, they returned to their deciduous forest sort of climax community. And all that's left are the old walls that identified one farmer's field from another. And so that's an example of secondary succession that's gone the whole distance. So these are two categories of succession. Another way of looking at it is through the sequence of the community. So there's a definite sequence of succession, whether it's primary or secondary. There are characteristics that are unique to the different phases of the communities that come in during the successional process. Who do you think gets there first after a disturbance? What are the characteristics of the species that get there first? Fast growing, yeah. Quick to reproduce, low survivorship, good dispersal. These are all characteristics that describe what type of organisms are selected organisms. That's right. We call these pioneer species. Sometimes they're referred to as weedy species. They get in there, they're quick to recruit, quick to grow, but they don't stick around long because it's not long before they're pushed out by better competitors. Right? So, early successional communities tend to be dominated by what we call pioneer species. They're the ones that get there first. High dispersal. So the high dispersal means that they can find bits of open habitat over a long range. Wherever there's a reproducing individual, its offspring, its propagules, have a broad range that they can disperse, and the likelihood that somewhere in that range they're going to find some disturbed habitat to recruit to is greater than if they had a very short dispersal distance. They're fast growing, so they get in there, they can take advantage of the thing, but they tend to be short-lived. They also tend to have very high fecundity, because remember there's this direct relationship. The lower your survival, the higher your fecundity is. Compensate to maximize your fitness. But eventually these get replaced by late successional communities. These are a series of transitions. And these are very much opposite. These tend to be slow-growing, superior competitors, low fecundity, short dispersal, high survivorship. In other words, case-like species. So these tend to be long-lived, slow-growing, superior competitors. They take their time getting there. It may take them a while to get there, but once they get there, they establish a sort of a stranglehold on the resource, and they edge out everybody else. And so in our example, in those two examples of succession, it's those long-lived, slow-growing large trees that become the late successional communities, either deciduous broadleaf trees in the bottom example or the large coniferous trees in the top example. And they are typical of a late successional community. And the last successional community in the recovery process is what we call a climax community. A climax community is a community that doesn't change appreciably in structure over time. It's the stable, sort of final state of a community. Now, it's all relative, because the notion of a climax community makes no sense on evolutionary timescales, because we know that stuff that was around 10 million years ago isn't around today. There's no such thing as a persistent community on that time scale. But we're talking on the time scale of tens, dozens, hundreds of years that there's little change. So those biomes we talked about when we introduced ecology, those are examples of the climax communities for those particular regions of the globe. The stable, persistent communities that are what you find in those regions. All right, so here's just an example of the successional process. So there's an old field, the top's going to be cloud. The first thing to arrive are the short-lived weed species, pioneering species. And they change the community. They change a lot of aspects of the soil. They make the soil higher in moisture content because it's not being the effects of the sun on the soil is less. There's less evaporation because there's some cover to the soil. They increase the organic content of the soil because as they die, their biomass decomposes and increases the nitrogen and phosphorus levels of the soil. So in many ways, they make the environment suitable for the next species to arrive. And that's where this notion of climates came about. It seems like they're doing a job. They're getting there and they're basically terraforming the field for the next generation of species to be able to come in. If not for their action, other plants might not be able to grow there. They make it possible for those plants to grow. Where Clements went wrong was he thought they did this willingly and intentionally, and in fact, no. They're not doing it willingly, it's just inevitable, but while they're doing what they're doing, they're trying to maximize their fitness. So then, early successional communities, things like grasses and shrubs come in, perennial, but not as competitive. And these get replaced by even longer living, slower growing things, small trees and larger shrubs. And then eventually, late successional, longer lived trees begin to invade. Eventually they grow up, shade out the other plants, and you wind up with your old growth climax community of large, very slow growing, very competitively dominant trees. And that's your climax community. And it may take 200 years to get there. It's a very slow and directed process. Okay. So, it's on. Who's right? Okay? Two views of how communities work. And I thought it was appropriate to put them in a Duchess of Marksbury, Queen's Rules sort of fisticuffs pose, because that's when a lot of stuff was being introduced. And it was just a popularity contest based on looks. I don't know. Lisa looks a little bit like a turtle, so maybe Clements would win, right? He's kind of got that avuncular professorial look to him, with great temples. But turns out he was wrong. But let's talk about their views. So let's review how they would see succession. Based on their views of community dynamics, they would see succession in very different ways. Clements would have a very anthropomorphic and, I use the term romantic because it's kind of appealing. It's nice to think, it's kind of romantic to think about nature as being this altruistic, cooperative, working force for good, for the better good. Right? So Clements saw succession in a couple of ways. He saw primary succession like embryology. You're building a brand new organism from scratch. You start with a blank slate, and the whole thing grows from the earliest stage to the final product. Right? So he saw it a lot like embryology. And the thing about embryology is, sure, we all look a little different, but basically, we all went through the same series of developmental pathways on our journey from zygote to adult, right? Human development is a pretty preordained series of events, okay? And so there's no surprises. You get the same thing every time, a human. You saw secondary succession more like wound healing, right? So there's a disturbance, and your body does the best to return it to the state it was beforehand. It may not be possible to get it absolutely perfectly like it was, but that's what you try. Your body tries to heal to replace it. Now, we have limited capacity, so we're not like lizards. We lose our tail, it doesn't grow back, right? Although, early in life, if you lose part of your finger, it will actually grow back. Okay, so the regenerative capacity of early humans is pretty impressive. So he saw communities that way. They get disturbed, and they try and heal themselves and return themselves back to the state they were before the disturbance. And that's their goal. And everybody's on board, working cooperatively towards this end. And that's his view of community dynamics. And he thought succession, there's a cookbook. This is how communities recover. It's the same process. You just start at different points in the process, depending on how severe the disturbance is. If it's primary disturbance or primary succession, you start on page 1. If it's secondary succession, you start somewhere forward on page 1. If it's a big disturbance, maybe page 2. If it's a very minor disturbance, the second to last page of the book. But you always repeat the same set of instructions to get back to the final climate of the community. And these distinct sequence of communities that he called seers, and that's a term that's more applied to plant communities. And most of this work, again, was with plant communities. Why? Because it's easy to study community dynamics with plants. They're very well behaved from the sort of observational perspective. And basically, you could identify these communities, and there was a set combination of species associated with each of these transitional communities, right? So pioneer species included these species, and early successional communities had these species, and mid-successional communities had another set of species, and late successional communities had another set of species, and finally the climax community had its own distinct assemblage of species. And it's an orderly sequence and sharp transitions, whereas Gleason had a very different view. He said, no, that's wrong. Doesn't make sense. He says, no, succession is just the result of individual species responses. The species gets into the community after a disturbance, and it's only about one thing, itself. And it does anything it can to stick around and maximize its fitness. And it's not interested in making the community a better place for someone else to move into. No. Going to do whatever it can to prevent that. It may be limited in its ability to do that, but it's not interested in giving way to another species. It's got no sense of community obligation. It's my time to go because it's time for the next successional community. No, it's in there as long as it can be. And community sequences can vary following disturbance. So he had a view that it's kind of chaotic. What happens is very much a function of who gets there when. And if species get there in different sequences, you may have very different outcomes to succession in two communities following a disturbance. It's about who gets there and what they do when they get there. Not about, oh, this is what we need to do, this is where we need to go as a community. Now, initially, Clemens's views were widely adopted because people studying succession observed these predictable patterns of recovery with distinct species assemblages associated with these different communities. But the problem was they were studying the same communities and a similar disturbance. So what's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Right? Well, they were basically observing the same phenomena over and over again with almost identical conditions. And guess what? Getting the same result. It's when they started looking at a broader range and comparing different communities and different circumstances, then Gleason's work was
became more and more accepted. But initially, Gleason was kind of ridiculed for his views. And he kind of got out of the ecology business, community ecology. He went back to plant systematics. And it's only later in his career when people started taking more interest in his ideas that he returned to this. So this is kind of a graphic representation of what these two views of succession look like. The top would be Gleason's view. Each colored line represents a different species, and you can see there are several different successional communities that each have distinct assemblages of species associated with them, and they're very sharp and distinct transitions. You go from pioneer species to early successional communities, early successional to mid to late to climax. These very distinct transitions. It's all orderly according to the book, right? Whereas Gleason's view was it's chaos, you know? Species come and go, and there's no sort of pattern to who comes and who's associated with whom. But while they're there, they're doing one thing and one thing only. Maximizing their own interests, their fitness. And when they go, it's not voluntarily, because they've been pushed out by somebody. So it's a much more chaotic view. No distinct transitional communities, no distinct assemblages of species, no sharp transitions between successional communities. Now, a key to understanding succession is to understand interactions between species that are involved in the successional process. Because now you've got species coming together at different times, different combinations, and we've learned that these species are going to interact. They're going to be engaged in these 5 or 6, 5 categories of interspecific interactions that we're talking about. Competition, predation, commensalism, mutualism, commensalism. So these interactions are going to occur between species. And when we talk about these interactions and their effect on succession, there are 3 basic types of successional interactions we can identify. And they may be as a result of any one of those interspecific interactions. Right? So I'll give you an example in a minute. But let's name the 3 types of interactions that can occur during the successional process. One is called facilitation. And as the name suggests, one species, the presence of one species in the community actually does something to that habitat that makes it easier for another species to enter into that community. Right? So there's some change or some effect that first species has had that makes it easier for another species to recruit and live in that community. It may be that that species is changing the abiotic components of that environment, making it more moist or cooler or richer in nitrogen or whatever, that allows another species to live there that couldn't live there in the conditions that existed previously. Right? So that's facilitation. Now you might think that that is an example of altruism or commensalism, but it's not. This species, the one that's doing the service, is not doing it for the sake of the other. It's doing it for its own benefit. It just happens to have an effect that makes it easier for that species to come in. So it could be a commensal interaction, or it could be an indirect interaction. Right? It could be, a predator eating a competitor and making it possible for an inferior competitor to get into that system. Right? So it could be any number of interspecific interactions, but the bottom line is something one species does makes it easier for another species to enter into that community and become established in that community. It facilitates the entrance of that other species. In contrast, you have inhibition. And here, it's exactly the opposite. Something one species does makes it harder for another species to come in. And again, it could be predation, it could be competition, it could be amensalism, probably not commensalism or mutualism, right? But it could be any number of interactions that does it. But the important thing to remember is with respect to the successional process, species A does something that makes it easier for species B, or harder for species B to get into that ecosystem or that community. Now here's the interesting thing. You could have 2 species And one species could be doing something that facilitates the arrival of the other species, and at the same time doing something that inhibits. So you can have the same two species engaged in both these types of interactions at the same time. And we'll show you an example of that when we talk about Glacier Bay, the Treaty Glacier. Finally, we have what's called tolerance. And tolerance just means that one species, the presence of one species, neither inhibits nor facilitates the arrival. In other words, it's well tolerated. The term tolerated is used in the pharmaceutical industry when you could take a drug and if you're taking one drug, this other drug can be taken without any complicating factors. Right? It's not that two do anything together, it's just that they're well tolerated by each other. So that's kind of the idea. Someone's in there, and this other species comes in, and it's neither help nor hinder. In other words, it's neutral. It doesn't have an effect. So those are the three possibilities of successional interactions. Now I want you to make sure you don't confuse successional interactions with interspecific interactions. Successional interactions are specific to the successional process. In other words, they talk about things one species does that influences the successional process with respect to another species. And like I said, they can take the form of any of these interspecific interactions. And when we go through some specific examples, we'll identify which interspecific interaction is going on here, as well as what successional interaction is causing in the process. All right. So there's our basic structural framework for successional interaction. So now we can start talking about who was right in their view of community dynamics, Gleason or Clements. Well, like I said, initially Clements was widely accepted. It seemed to hold up when people studied disturbance in these communities. It seemed to progress in a similar fashion. But it turns out it's because they had a very myopic view. They were looking at a very narrow piece of the world and repeating the experiment time and time again under similar conditions. And you would expect similar results under similar conditions. But the truth of the matter is, in nature, you don't have similar conditions all the time. But the data, as we started to understand how communities are put together and how they function, started to increasingly support Gleason's view. And there's several independent things. I'll mention a few ideas that support this. For instance, this notion of keystone species that we talked about, right? Anyone remember what the definition of a keystone species is? Species whose effects on the community are disproportionately large compared to their biomass. In other words, small biomass, big effect. Orcas, sea otters, sea stars, fish in ponds. But whether or not these species are there, turns out it has a big influence on what the climax community of that community is. If you've got sea otters, you've got a kelp forest. If you don't have sea otters, you've got an urchin barren. That's a very different climax community, right? So this notion that that community has one climax community, it's always going to recover in that process, is not held up by this notion of the influence of keystone species on community structure. Okay? Same thing with wolves. Wolves present, you get birch trees and rich riparian habitats and lots of water because there's busy little beavers building dams and lodges everywhere, right? Take the wolves out, all that goes away. And you get basically grasslands grazed down to, because the elk are eating all the tree recruits, okay, and the willow. So, keystone species and our understanding of their role in community dynamics support a Gleasonian view of community dynamics, not a Clementian view. I'm going to show you an experiment where they basically put that to the test. Let's create 12 identical conditions of primary succession, these big, as the Beverly Hillbillies would say, the cement pond, right? So they had these big cement ponds that they created, and all they put was sterile water, right? And then they said, all right, let's let communities develop in these ponds, and let's see how similar they are. If Gleason had it right, they should be all different. If Clements had it right, they should look all the same. So I'm going to show you the results of that experiment. So experimental evidence, like these cement pond experiments of succession, support Gleason's view. And then finally, natural long-term experiments support Gleason's view. So a natural experiment is one that we don't instigate, we just take advantage of it. If you're an oceanographer, we have a great one that happens every 4 to 7 years. It's called El Nino, right? We understand a lot about how the oceanic ecosystem works when there's a big disturbance like an El Nino. In the case of terrestrial habitats, fire would be a great example of a natural experiment. And you could document the recovery of a forest after a fire. But the one we're going to talk about is this retreat of this glacier in Alaska that's been going on for 200 years that allows us to look at the successional process, both through time and in different locations. All right. So here's that pond experiment. The basic experimental protocol is they take 12 big, huge ponds, and they put them all in the same spot, and so they have the same exposure to recruitment, so that the same potential recruits can get to any one of the ponds. And then let these ponds continue for a period of time, and they look at what species they find in those ponds. And what you see is each pond has sort of a core group of species, of about 20 or so species that are found in each pond. But then there's another 40 or so species that are in some ponds and not in others. So the final community, if you look at the species numbers on this axis and the different number of species in each pond, you see that each pond has a similar number of terminal species in it. But the species composition of those final ponds, or those sort of climax community ponds, are very different. Very different combination of species. So that doesn't suggest that the same successional pathway occurred in each pond. That suggests that very different successional pathways occurred, and there are very different climax communities associated with these ponds. It's pretty good experimental evidence supporting Gleason's view. And we'll not understand how that says that. Don't be afraid to ask clarification. Okay. All right. But the greatest example is Glacier Bay, which is up in the panhandle of Alaska, Glacier Park, and it's this big bay, and we actually know how the history of this glacier retreat, because as far back as 1794, there was an expedition that demarcated the edge of the glacier. So back in 1794, the glacier was all the way down at the mouth of the bay, almost out to the ocean. And then subsequent visits to the area, you can see it retreated. So about 100 years later, it was halfway up the valley. And now, 1994 is the most recent data, you can see it's way up at the head of the valley. And so basically, the longer this glacier soil has been exposed, the longer the successional pathway has been going on. And it's like a time machine, right? So it's like you can start at the very head of the valley, and that's now. And you can go forward 200 years into the future and see what it's going to look like by walking down the base of the valley. Right? So time travel is possible. You just have to go to Glacier Bay. So, Glacier Bay natural experiment. The glacier's been treated for over 200 years, and it provides an opportunity to compare different successful communities. As you go farther down the valley, you're getting into later and later successful communities. And you can keep tracking those communities. So people have been studying this place for 30, 40 years, maybe even longer. And so they've been able to observe these successional communities make a transition to older communities. And that gives you the opportunity to not only see whether there's a distinct pathway as you go up the valley, but whether that pathway is uniform at every location, whether you get the same successional process at every location. All right. So, one hypothesis would be something Clement would propose. He would say, you know what, there's only one successional pathway, and this is it. Brand new soils that have been exposed for 20 years or less, they have only willow, shrubs, and dryas, which is a type of bushy shrub growing on early successional communities, pioneering species. Then as they get a little older, about 45 to 80 years, you start to get these alder trees and cottonwood trees, which are medium lived, smaller trees. They're not as competitive as larger trees, but they get there and grow quicker. And then these, by about 100 years, start getting replaced by spruce trees. Spruce trees move in and grow in and replace the alder trees. And then finally, after about 200 years, you get these dense, well-established stands of spruce and western hemlock, which are dominant, competitive dominants. They're very long-lived, slow-growing trees. They sprout up, shade out the forest, and pretty much nothing can grow underneath of them. Okay? And that's your climax community. So the idea is that's what you find down here, and way up here at the top of the glacier, you only find this willow and dryas. But if we all, watched what we ate and exercised and, didn't drink, we could come back in 150 years and we see hemlock and spruce trees up there at the valley head. That's what Gleason would propose, or Clemens would propose. But, in fact, it seems like something else is going on. So the actual thing from the observed thing is that in some cases, in the lower valley, you do get that pattern, where you get hemlock and spruce trees. But in the upper bay, the alder get in there, the spruce tried to go, but the spruce really never take over, they don't do as well, and there's a mixture of spruce and alder trees. Okay? And at the very uppermost bay, you get alder and spruce and cottonwood, but the alder die back, and really it's only the cottonwood and the spruce that ever grow. But you never get any hemlock ever in the upper valley. So why? What is it that's different about the lower valley versus the upper valley that you never get this hemlock forest, this dense hemlock forest? Yeah?
Can you say elevation?
Could be elevation. We'll answer the question. Okay. I'm putting it to you. I actually know the answer. But I don't want to spoil it. You haven't seen the movie. All right, so what accounts for the different patterns of succession that are actually being observed in the valley? Well, remember, we go to those successional interactions and ask what's going on here. Turns out there are three things you have to kind of figure out to understand the successional process. This is the modern synthesis of succession. Things you kind of have to get a handle on to understand the successional process. The first is the traits of the species involved. You've got to know your players. You've got to know their physiological tolerances. You've got to know who is capable of living where and when. Right? To understand why you do or do not have a species there, you need to know if it's even possible for that species to live there, period. Because if it's not, that's a pretty much direct answer why you don't have it there. Right? So this is knowing the individual species traits, its physiological tolerances, its capability. Basically, this is defining the fundamental niche of every species involved. To get a sense of if it's even possible for that species to live there. So that tells you who can live there. But just because you can theoretically live somewhere doesn't mean you will live there. There are other things that are going to determine that. Right? And those things are the following. You need to know about these species interactions that are occurring, these successional interactions. You need to know whether there are inhibition interactions occurring, where organisms are preventing others from coming in, whether there's facilitation occurring, who can tolerate who. You have to understand all of these. This is basically telling you who does what to whom and when. So this is going to allow you to figure out why an organism whose fundamental niche is within the limits of this area is not here because someone's keeping them out. Or why it takes something to happen before an organism can come in. Right? Another organism may require
some facilitation to occur before it can establish in that community. Right? Maybe that one species changes the physiological, the abiotic environment and makes it now within the fundamental niche of a species to come in. But there's one more thing we have to do, and this is the biggest problem. It's the forest for the trees, right? You can't study a forest by looking at a tree. So you need to know not only what's going on in the disturbance area, but you've got to know what's going on around the disturbance, because that is where your source of recruits is going to be to supply species that aren't there anymore. So that is basically the historical and environmental circumstances. What's around the area disturbed? So what happened before that? What was there before, or what's present next door around that? That's going to influence the successional process. So you need to have a handle on all three of these things to have any hope of predicting or understanding why whatever successional pathway curve did. And it will explain why you might get different results in different areas, because these components are different in different areas. So let's take an example using Glacier Bay and looking at these species involved. So let's talk about species traits. An example looking at species traits. So hemlock, right? That was the big player. Why you have it in the lower valley, not in the upper valley? Well, is there something about the hemlock that constrains where it can grow? So it's the hemlock stream. When a hemlock sprouts up, basically, it has a very high organic requirement. It needs a lot of nitrogen. It won't grow in nitrogen-poor soils, right? So that pretty much rules out it growing initially in the upper bay when those first glacier soils are exposed, because they're very low in nitrogen. So that's going to put a constraint on where it can grow. It's only going to grow in soils that have become established and have accumulated organic material and have a high nitrogen. And it'll grow in the shade, but not in the bright sunlight. So if you don't have tall trees shading it, it won't grow, even if there's organic material in the soil. So it's only going to grow in a forest setting. If you don't have a forest, you're never going to get that hemlock seedling to grow. It's prevent it from growing. So those UV exposed glacier habitats are outside the fundamental niche of a hemlock tree. And the hemlock needs that environment to change into a range it can tolerate physiologically before it can grow there. And it may never change to that state. And if it doesn't, hemlock will never grow there. And here's a very important one. Hemlock have a very limited dispersal capability. How do hemlock disperse? Well, seeds. Hemlock is an evergreen tree, and they produce their seeds in cones, right? And what disperses pine cones?
Fire.
Huh? Not creatures.
Squirrel.
Not fire. There you go. Gravity. They fall. And they fall down. And if there's a slope, they roll. Okay? But they don't blow away in the wind. And last I checked, animals don't eat them and poop them out somewhere else, although that would really clean out the old colon, right? Okay? So they don't have a dispersal capacity, a very limited dispersal. So if there's no close source of hemlock trees, no matter how appropriate the environment is, you're not going to get any hemlocks growing there because they don't have any way of getting there. Right? And it's very hard for hemlock pine cones to roll uphill to the upper valley. All right, let's talk about species interactions. Use some examples of those. We'll start with alder trees. They play a key role in this ecosystem. The presence of alder trees actually helps spruce trees grow. Why? Because alder trees in their roots have these nodules with these symbiotic bacteria that fix nitrogen. Take nitrogen gas, which is plentiful in the air, and convert it to nitrite and nitrate, which is a form that the Sitka spruce needs.
So spruce actually grow faster in the presence of alders than they do on their own. So the alder makes it easier for the spruce tree recruit to grow there. Now, do you think the alder is trying to make this place a better place for a spruce tree to grow so they can eventually overgrow it, shade it, and kill it?
Oh, yeah.
No. It's just a byproduct of its particular traits. So spruce trees grow faster in the presence of alder. That would be an example of facilitation. Okay? But don't think for a minute the alder tree just sits there and takes it, right? Because the same time it's helping it, it's trying to shade the spruce tree. It's shading the spruce tree, limiting its light, making it grow slower because it knows what's in store if that spruce tree is able to overgrow it. So the same time it's facilitating it in the roots, it's inhibiting it with its branches and shading. So it slows down the inevitable, but it can't stop. Unless the soils are poor enough in nitrogen that the spruce can't grow fast enough or big enough to overgrow the alder. So these are examples of facilitation and inhibition. Now let's back up to the hemlock tree. Let's say a hemlock seedling sprouted up in the forest of spruce trees, in the nice, shady, rich, organic forest floor. Will it be inhibited by those spruce trees? No, it's shade tolerance. So that would be a tolerance interaction, where the spruce is tolerated well by the hemlock, not inhibited by the hemlock. All right. So eventually the spruce, though, will outgrow, if it can, the alder and displace it, and it will then be kicked out of the ecosystem. So here would be an example of both facilitation and inhibition occurring between the same two species. And you can see this. Here's a graphic from your book where you can see that once alders become established, after about 50 or so years, you can see a huge increase in the organic content of the nitrogen content of the forest floor, as compared to just natural mineral soils without alder trees, which it does increase, but not nearly as well. So you can see the effect alder trees have on the nitrogen content of soils by their presence. They make it much more livable for these higher nitrogen species of trees, spruce and hemlock trees. All right, what about the historical context? Well, remember this was a glacier. So the glacier rolled down this valley and covered everything in its path. But the thing about valleys is they're a lot deeper at their bottom than at their head, right? Carved out by rivers, right? So if a glacier rolled down a valley, eventually it's going to get deep enough, potentially, that top of the glacier won't go all the way up to the edge of the valley, right? It'll actually only go up part of the valley, at the very base of the valley where it's the deepest, right? So the ice levels in the upper valley, when the glacier initially advanced, was higher than the tree line. In fact, it covered over everything. No trees survived in the upper valley. Hemlock, spruce, they were all gone. Killed. Oh, sorry. Thank you. It should be like a buzzer that goes off. So there was no source of tree recruits. There was no hemlock trees nearby in the upper valley to provide recruits. So it doesn't matter how shady and organic that soil will get, if you never get a hemlock seed there, you'll never get one to grow. But if you look at the lower valley, the glacier height never made it all the way up to the top of the valley at its height. So some hemlock trees survived on the upper parts of the valley walls. And when the glacier retreated, guess what? They dropped pine cones, and where did those pine cones roll? Downhill. And so there was a source of recruits in the lower valley once the soils became suitable for growing hemlock. So you can wait till, we can come back in 200 years and there still won't be hemlock trees in the upper valley because there's no source of recruits to seed that part. But after 200 years, there nice hemlocks growing at the bottom of the lower valley because there was a source of recruits for them up on the edges of the hills that was able to provide hemlock seeds to grow. So you see, you have to think of all these things, physiological tolerances, the kinds of successional interactions that occur, and the historical and environmental context to understand why the bottom valley is going to have a very different climax community than the upper valley. Make sense, everybody?